I'm Jessie Munton. I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy. Welcome to my exp. It's a really complex question, what is prejudice? It's a really multifaceted phenomenon, and I see my work as contributing one small, hopefully helpful element in our broader understanding of it, but I don't want to make any claims to kind of be giving an exhaustive analysis of it. When we think about different forms of prejudice, traditionally perhaps we might identify three different elements in them. So sometimes prejudice can involve an irrational or ill-founded belief. I think Michelle Moody Adams has this nice phrase that it's a kind of particular conception of reality. Prejudice can also involve a kind of affective element. It doesn't seem always like it's enough to just capture it in terms of what you believe, but also how you feel about certain groups. Perhaps that can involve, for instance, disgust or revulsion or something similar to that. Thirdly, prejudice can seem like it often involves a behavioural element of some kind. It's not enough that you just have these attitudes, maybe they're manifesting in your behaviour. Sometimes it might be hard to definitively say if you do or don't have a certain belief, but we can concretely notice that you're behaving in certain ways. I want to introduce another element, which is that I think prejudice can reside in how we prioritise and order information. So disproportionately focusing on a particular subset of beliefs, relying on them when you're performing certain inferences, focusing on a subset of evidence that you have about a certain group, so focusing only on the negative things and not the positive things. That can, I think, be a really important form that prejudice takes that isn't captured by those other three elements. Habits of attention contribute to prejudice in a whole range of ways. So perhaps most simply, it could be that the prejudice beliefs you already have shape what you attend to going forwards. So it might be that believing, for instance, that girls are going to be less good at maths, you're then paying more attention to the performance of boys in your maths class in a way that leads you to neglect the ways in which actually the girls might be performing quite well. But it's more complex than that, because sometimes you might have the pattern of attention without having the particular belief state. So you could have somebody who would disavow that belief that boys are likely to perform better at maths, but put them in the classroom and they might still be attending disproportionately to the positive performance of the boys in a way that leads them to form inaccurate downstream beliefs, but also in ways which might lead them to behave in problematic ways. It's also important in terms of how you reason, even how you reason about topics which might not obviously seem like they're connected to race or gender or sexuality. If certain beliefs end up functioning a bit like hubs or connectors which your inferences get kind of directed through, then that's going to lead to downstream problems in some way or other. So for instance, if it is very salient to you the ways in which women have a particular role as caregivers or as bearers of children, and then any time you are asked a question to which that could become relevant, you're kind of pulling that in and drawing on it, that's going to skew the ways in which you reason and the ways also in which you gather evidence. So we can't attend to everything. You have to be selective in what evidence you attend to, the way and what your perceptual system even picks up on. And so there's this kind of selective attentional process going on even there. And if that's skewed in certain ways, I think that can result in a form of prejudice. One of the big advantages of this way of thinking about prejudice is, in some ways, it almost collapses the distinction between the individual and the environment. So what you attend to is in no way just up to you. It also depends on, at a very boring brute physical level, the space that you are in. And so if you have big billboards around you, for instance with adverts on them that are presenting certain groups in certain ways, for instance very sexualised images of women, then of course you're going to be attending to the sexualised properties of women. That's not something we need to blame you for, but it's really important to recognise that that is a pattern that is emerging in how you attend and that can become calcified. So it's then going to shape what things you attend to downstream. You develop these habits of attention that it's really hard for the individual to break. So in some ways that's going to be a controversial element of the account, because often we think that prejudice or bias is something that we blame somebody for. And once we recognise that it can reside in patterns of attention, those things are not always directly at the behest of the individual. They can't directly shape them, even though they may be able to do other things which shape their dispositions at a more general level. But actually, I think that's a really helpful element of the account, that these questions about responsibility can sometimes throw us off from being adequately able to kind of recognise the phenomenon as it occurs. When we think about prejudice in terms of attention, it is a really societal phenomenon. We don't attend just on our own. Our attentional habits are shaped by other people and develop in coordination with other people. And so prejudice at this attentional level is something that arises socially, though we can also describe the role of the individual within that. So one question that's very natural to ask is, if we aren't aware even of these prejudices, can we be responsible for them? I think questions about responsibility are so complex that part of me wants to say, I want to leave some of that to the ethicists and we can give them a ring and get them to come in and help us resolve some of this. I do think there are ways in which we can be responsible for it. You might notice that there are all sorts of other contexts in which we hold people responsible for things that they were not aware of. That happens legally and criminally. You know, there's a certain degree of luck involved in if you hit somebody in a car, whether or not they survive, but that might have an impact on what we hold you responsible for afterwards. But also I think the individual has an important role to play in shaping their habits of attention, thinking about what things they're exposing themselves to that are changing how they attend downstream. It can sound a bit moralising, but I think we need to think critically about the ways in which the media that we absorb and engage with is shaping the ways in which we attend beyond that. So yeah, I think we can hold the individual responsible at some level, even if we don't think that they're in a position to always notice or control each individual distribution of their attention. I was really struck when I was pregnant that it's just not known whether lots of drugs are safe for pregnancy because nobody's done the research that you'd need to do in order to find that out. So that's maybe an example of something that each individual case of not testing a particular drug in pregnancy, there's a good reason why that's not done. It might be resource intensive in certain ways. But it contributes to this broader kind of shaping of our medical knowledge that prioritises and centres perhaps male bodies at the expense of fully having a more nuanced working out of female bodies in pregnancy and the significance of drugs for that. Equally, if you think of the much worse outcomes that African American women in the States enjoy in childbirth relative to their white compatriots, that's another example of the ways in which we don't know enough, and that knowledge is leading to worse outcomes for one group than another. There's probably ways in which that's to the benefit of the dominant group, that more resources are being poured into the resolution of one set of problems that concern them rather than another set of problems. We could use the term power-based ignorance to describe all of these different forms. So Robin Dembroff as well has written about the phenomenon of straight ignorance, where straight people can be ignorant of the experience of their queer counterparts in a way that doesn't flip in the other direction. So we could use that term power-based ignorance to describe a broad range of different kinds of ignorance that can arise that track these patterns of power. The million-dollar question is, can we become less prejudiced? And that question perhaps has two elements to it. Can we theoretically identify routes that might take us to being less prejudiced? And then practically, how feasible is it to implement that? I want to be tentatively optimistic here, and also, nod very significantly to work in social psychology, which investigates this question much more directly. I think there's evidence that we can, in small ways, shape our minds as individuals, that also socially there are interventions that we can make that can change how prejudiced people are. It is tentatively encouraging that, for instance, if you look at measures of implicit bias, they have reduced a lot towards lesbian, gay and bisexual people over the last 40, 50 years, though there's also some reason to be concerned that that might be being undone at the moment. It's really interesting to try and figure out why that has happened with that particular form of implicit bias in a way that has not been replicated, for instance, in terms of racial biases. I think the biggest thing we know is that intimate contact with other people, knowing other people, loving other people, having them as your friends and neighbours is probably the single biggest thing that reduces prejudice. But of course, that's not something that we can easily script. Who you're friends with and who you love is itself shaped by power structures that are already in place. Perhaps the biggest misconception about prejudice that I would like people to reconsider is the idea that it resides in the content of what you believe. That if you don't endorse a particular content, then you're not prejudiced, if you don't endorse a particular belief. It can also really matter what you attend to and what you pay attention and what you prioritise. So there can be room for you to not have beliefs which have explicit prejudicial content, but nonetheless perhaps for there to be prejudiced ways of engaging with the world and with other people in virtue of what things you're attending to and what information you're prioritising, and then what things you are ignoring and not coming to know